Seminarau ar-lein Adran y Gymraeg ag Astudiaethau Celtaidd Prifysgol Aberystwyth. Dr. Kerron Ó Luain. Arm Cochachar Gaeilgeoirí. Radical Irish language group Misneach in the 20th and 21st centuries. The 22nd of February, 2022.
Okay, well, Gymraeg agus fáilte road gyda yn Seminarau ag rhain y bratnisio agus lein cheltach yn sio yn Ysgol Aberystwyth. Croeso I chi gyd i'r seminar yma gan yr Adran Gymraeg agus Astudiaethau Celtaidd yma yn Aberystwyth. Welcome to you all. And particularly to our speaker tonight, Dr. Kerron Ó Luain, who has had a terrible journey to get to Aberystwyth, but he's arrived with us and we're very pleased to see him. Kerron is, he did his BA and MA at the National University of Ireland in Galway, and then went on to do a PhD at Queen's in Belfast, and he is currently working as a research fellow at Dublin City University on the history of the Gaeilgeoirí movement, 1973 to 2023, so to coincide with the 50th anniversary. In general, his research interest is anti-colonial and decolonial movement in Ireland in the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. And he is going to speak to us tonight about the radical Irish language group Misneach in the 20th and 21st centuries. Kerron, fáilte road.
Gormadet Simon, diolch nosweit da your Gaeilge is far better than my Bratnish, my Gymraeg. Good evening and thanks for the invitation to the seminar. We should obviously probably start by explaining the words in the quotations there, Arm Cathartha Gaeilgeoirí, or a citizen's army of Irish speakers. This was referred to by Martin O'Kane in his influential pamphlet published in 1970, Glúiseach na Gaeilge, Glúiseach their stray, which translates roughly as the Irish language movement, the wayward movement. O'Kane, the foremost Irish language writer of the 20th century, a Trinity College lecturer, Gaeltacht activist, former Irish Republican Army member and socialist, was calling on Irish speakers not to take up arms, but to mobilise towards direct action. O'Kane was nearing the end of his life, however, by 1970. He had been involved in Republican and social activism for over 40 years, playing a key role in the 1930s through Cumann na Gaeltachta and Winter na Gaeltachta in founding the Gaeltacht settlement of Rathcarn in the east of the country. He was later active in the 1940s in the IRA, although he became disillusioned with the organisation's militarism and lack of a social programme for radical societal change. The reference to a citizen's army draws on the tradition of 1916 rising leader James Connolly and his Irish Citizens' Army. The ICA was founded in 1913 to protect striking workers from the brutality of the Dublin Metropolitan Police during the Great Dublin Lockout of 1913 of that year. The radical socialist tradition of James Connolly then was one of the key strands in O'Kane's thought. The second strand was that of language conservation and revivalism, which drew strongly on the cultural nationalist tradition. The genesis of the Irish language revivalism can be traced back in ideological terms to the 19th century and the Young Irelanders of the 1840s, the Society for the Preservation of the Irish Language of 1876, Cumann na Gaeilge, founded in 1893, and through to Pádraig Pearse, the revolutionary and educationalist who was executed following the 1916 Rising. These cultural nationalist movements and figures elevated the Irish language as the marker of national identity and drew into sharp focus the impact British colonialism had on the decline of the language. Ó Luain embodied these two strands of socialism and cultural nationalism. According to Mairead O'Donnell, a member of Misneach, the radical Irish language group Ó Luain was central to during the 1960s, he provided the mostly young activists in the group with direction. She described him as a Che Guevara type figure for the younger membership, a figure who had a great presence and was a strong leader. But apart from Ó Luain, who were in Misneach, the Irish Examiner described them as a national language movement. This is in 1966. The Evening Herald as an Irish Ireland group. They were described as an ultra-left Irish language group by the Irish press, while the Irish Times called Misneach a Save Irish group, and their detractors in the language freedom movement, which I'll talk about later in more detail, bizarrely branded them neo-fascist. However, it seems that membership and the ideology required to be part of Misneach in the 1960s was never really vetted or laid out in exact detail. Though left-wing ideas certainly seem to have been in the ascendancy, there was also members who were more conservative in their thinking, but looking for an outlet for more radical protest action. The group was never formally structured, instead preferring a loose method of organisation. Despite this malleability, ideologically speaking, most members were united on at least 4 key points. Firstly, that the Dublin government had failed to realise the aims of the 1916 Rising and implement an Irish-speaking republic, instead settling for a state built on mass emigration, poverty, and the marginalisation of the Irish language. Second, that the pre-existing Irish language organisations such as Cunna Gaeilge and Gaeilgeoirí were too close to the political establishment. Third, that politicians could not be trusted to see through the language revival. And fourth, that direct action was required to pressurise those in power to take seriously the challenges facing the Irish language. In terms of the literature, the historiography on Misneach, it's not substantial. There are only 2 published pieces, both online, that exist. One is a short article, essentially a blog piece that addresses the Misneach hunger strike of 1966, while the other is a peer-reviewed piece for Celtaidd by Hugh Rowland. This looks at the ideological conflict between Misneach and the Irish language freedom movement during the 1960s. Elsewhere, there are references to Misneach within larger works on Ó Luain by historians such as Andreas O'Cahasey. While these are useful contributions, Misneach still await a book-length treatment that sets them in their proper context. The backdrop to the emergence of Misneach was a decade which saw the globalising capitalist forces of T.K. Whittaker's 1958 programme for economic expansion begin to bite. The plan further embedded the 26 county economy, that's the 26 counties of Ireland, into the globalising capitalist system. It did so by reorientating the primary mode of economic production away from agriculture in tandem with state-supported manufacture such as Bord na Móna and other state groups, and towards export-based technology industries driven by foreign direct investment, or FDI. Whittaker, an economist and civil servant, was an Irish speaker himself, and he went on to act as chairman of Bord na Gaeilge, the Irish language board, later on. A forthcoming publication from myself looks at these sort of ambiguities of power and class contradictions among Irish speakers within the context of the Gael School movement in the 1970s. But due in large part to Whittaker's 1958 plan, by the 1960s, Irish speakers began to feel the weakness of their position in a world of hegemonic languages like English, French, and Spanish. Whittaker's austere plan did nothing to arrest the decline of the language in the core Western Gaeltacht areas, and the revival project was soon to be abandoned by the state for one of bilingualism. Also on the horizon in terms of the emergence of Misneach for 1966 was the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. And almost none of the aims laid out by the leaders of those years around issues of living standards, equality, or indeed language revival had been achieved. In 1962, Saunders Lewis, who many of you will be familiar with, gave a radio talk on the BBC in which he advocated revolutionary methods and civil disobedience to save Welsh. The 60th of commemoration of which was held by Celtaidd just last Saturday. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend. But I digress. The year after Lewis's speech, 1963, O'Coin translated the oration into a pamphlet entitled Bás nó Batha, Life or Death. And Misneach was founded that same year. So one could really argue that the Misneach of the 1960s represented a blend of Irish republicanism, Conleyite socialism, cultural nationalism, and radical Welsh language activism. By the following year, 1964, an Evening Herald report noted that Misneach had about 40 active members in Dublin and with other branches in the provinces. That same year, the drift in state policy away from Irish language revival objectives, which had spurred the formation of Misneach, was given official sanction. The policy of retreat, never announced explicitly in public, was rubber-stamped in two reports issued during the mid-1960s. The first of these was Aviolca na Gaeilge, the restoration of the Irish language in 1964, which shifted the revival's focus from the state system and onto wider society. Its initial pages argued that the state was not wholly responsible for the revival. Instead, Manon Aheran, the women of Ireland, should take up the task because it was they who raised children. The opening clauses of its section on education, in a move intended to detract focus from the classroom, were clear in emphasising Ja Bhain agus Ja Hampla na Dishmahari, the good example and goodwill of parents to encourage children into speaking Irish. O'Coin, in his Irish Above Politics pamphlet in 1964, castigated the white paper that emerged from the commission as containing a deluge of cliches. He decried the commission as a packed jury designed to save face for government by making suggestions but not acting on them. In 1965, with encouragement or perhaps pressure from the OECD, the Investment in Education report was published. The report highlighted what it viewed as the weaknesses, quote, in the Irish state's education system, one of which was the emphasis on the Irish language. And it therefore solidified really in the official mind the link between education and globally focused economic development. Not coincidentally, the 1960s also witnessed the closure of the Cláistí Luna, the preparatory colleges, which for decades had equipped teachers with a high level of Irish to impart to pupils. This then really is the beginning of the encroachment of neoliberalism into the economy and society of the 26 counties. At the same juncture, in 1966, the state introduced a Housing Act, which led to the mass privatisation of public housing stock and has directly caused the current housing crisis. The neoliberalisation of state functions, whether in housing, education or language revival in the Irish state, preceded the Thatcherite decimation of Britain by more than a decade. Ben, of course, has done sterling work highlighting the destructive impact of neoliberalism on the Irish language in the Gaeilgeoirí post-2008. In the government reports and acts of the 1960s, we can discern the seeds of that destruction being sown. Also, O'Gilligan, Peter Vardy, Lloyd, Reagan and others have looked at the neo-colonial culture that existed within the state during the 1960s, well, from the 1920s really through to the 1960s, and how that culture within the state departments impacted the way Irish was treated. So this is what Misneach really were essentially up against and resisting in the 1960s, the unraveling of the social fabric, including Irish-speaking communities, by new macroeconomic and older historical colonial forces. Although founded in 1963, the coalescing of Misneach into a movement seems to have occurred over a period of 2 to 3 years. In January 1965, it held another inaugural meeting in the Royal Hibernian Hotel in Dublin in response to the aforementioned government white paper on the Irish language. At that meeting, another attempt was made to launch Misneach and recruit more members. By 1966, it claimed a membership of around 250 people, which, according to the Irish Times, were, quote, mainly from the professions and universities. The social basis for Misneach was consistent with that of the turn of the 20th century cultural revival. Cunna na Gaeilge, as Timothy G. McMahon has shown in occupational data gathered on 191 members for the years 1894 to 99, was strongly middle class. Around 25% of the membership were employed as professionals or priests, 20% as employers or managers, and 55% as skilled artisans, clerks, low-ranking civil servants, teachers, and shop assistants, with the semi-skilled and unskilled sectors of society being, quote, overwhelmingly underrepresented. Misneach also operated in a milieu of other left Republican and socialist groups, particularly in Dublin. In May 1967, representatives of Misneach, along with those from the trade union, Labour and Republican movements, Connolly Youth, Cunna na Gaeilge, the Irish Workers' Party and others, attended a commemoration for James Connolly at Kilmainham Jail, organised by Skeim na Gaeilgeoirí, the Irish trade union scheme. Speakers included Eamon McMash of Sinn Féin and Sam Nolan of the Irish Workers' Party. Seamus O'Toole, secretary of Misneach and editor of Sinn Féin's United Irishmen, and Kerron Ó Luain, a teacher and leading member of Misneach, spoke at the Connolly Week of 1968 on behalf of Misneach. Organised by Dublin Sinn Féin and held in the North Star Hotel in Dublin, the week-long event also featured lectures by Cathal Goulding of the Sinn Féin Ard Corla and chief of staff of the IRA. Meanwhile, leading member of Misneach, Eoin Ó Murchú, a graduate of TCD, founder member of the Trinity Republican Club, organiser of Cumann Gaelach and Cláiste, had by 1970 been appointed a full-time organiser for official Sinn Féin in the Gaeltacht. Although Misneach were organised to tackle the question of the Irish language from a political perspective and contained many dedicated political activists, much of the audience who attended its early meetings could perhaps be best described as culturalists who showed up for more social reasons. The aforementioned meeting held to discuss the white paper in January 1965 was attended by one woman whom the Irish press reported enjoyed, quote, traditional music and singing and likes to attend meetings and debates connected with the language revival. Indeed, throughout their existence, Misneach endeavoured to organise educational lectures as far as they could. And despite the attendance of culturalists, these lectures were usually political in nature. One such lecture on the life of Tomás Mac Donagh, another leader of 1916, was given in Enagh, County Tipperary, by Tomás Mac Liam on the 5th of February 1968. From the outset, Misneach faced opposition from establishment Irish language voices. Commenting on a radio interview Martin O'Kane had conducted with RTE, Diarmaid O'Halloran of the Irish Press wondered why Misneach should be founded at all. He accused O'Kane of being vague in laying out how Misneach sought to do things differently from the already existing language bodies such as Cunna na Gaeilge. Quote, "Codid na Slatini Driechta, what are the magic wands Misneach possessed?" he queried. A favourite tactic of Misneach's was to try to exert pressure on government ministers directly. This they did from early on, as in the case of Prunchis Ó Mian. The Derry man was jailed for a week in the spring of 1964 for refusing to pay his television licence due to the poor provision of Irish language content on RTE. Members of Misneach, including their secretary Seamus O'Toole, made their way to government buildings on the 25th of March. There they handed in letters to Taoiseach Sean Lamass and Charles Haughey, Minister for Justice, which demanded they meet a deputation from Misneach, and they urged those with the power to, quote, release Mr. O'Meehan without further delay. As the 50th commemoration of the Rising moved closer in 1965, Misneach began to plan to hold a symbolic hunger strike to coincide with the official events. The state was planning to use the 50th commemoration for its own ends. As historian Diarmaid Ferriter has noted, quote, it's clear that as well as genuflecting to an older Ireland, the official commemorations in 1966 were also about presentation of a new reality. There was a sidelining of the Republican movement in favour of a focus on a prosperous, modernised, and not just agricultural, but now also industrialised republic. What it amounted to, in essence, was a tug between past and future, end quote. In 1966, in the weeks leading up to the hunger strike, some branches of Conradh na Gaeilge voiced their support for Misneach. However, the leadership and the organisation as a whole remained at a distance. Misneach accused them of being, quote, bound financially and intellectually to the state. O'Coin later fleshed out this argument in Glúiseach na Gaeilge, Glúiseach de Stray, where he further accused the Conradh of being in an intellectual ghetto. The 1966 hunger strike comprised 12 men and 1 woman, Prunchis Niguit, and it was held in a tenement building off Parnell Street with a doctor in attendance at times. There were also 6 men, all members of Conradh na Gaeilge, Cumann Clonard, who held the hunger strike in Belfast in protest at the neglect of Irish by the Storm government. At a meeting in the Shelbourne Hotel in Dublin the night before the hunger strike had commenced, Diarmaid O'Sullivan and Martin O'Coin condemned the, quote, celebrating hucksters who sought to sell Ireland off. The speakers hoped, they said, that, quote, the hunger strike might light some little spark that would illuminate the road to the Republic, which Tone, Pearse Connolly and countless others died to obtain. The Cork branch of Misneach, including Rishtard O'Murrachu and Seamus Rushell, issued a statement in support of the hunger strike the day it commenced, 11th of April 1966. We of the language movement, quote, we of the language movement feel obliged to express in a practical manner by engaging in 1 week's hunger strike our non-participation in these celebrations. By our action, inadequate though it may appear, we hope to retrieve from almost certain oblivion the real ideals and aspirations of Connolly and Pearse in that first glorious Easter week. On the second day of the hunger strike, members of Misneach made their way to Leinster House to stage a picket. However, Gardaí, the police, obstructed them from reaching government buildings. One of the organisers of the picket slammed the obstruction as completely illegal. The Gardaí had no rights, they said, quote, to stop us picketing since the Offences Against the State Act is not enforced when the Dáil, the Parliament, is not sitting. Other pickets were held throughout the week-long hunger strike at locations such as the GPO, and the protests gained coverage in the global media, with the New York Times and Italian television covering the event. When the hunger strike ended, members of the organisation stated their belief that they had been successful in raising awareness about the lack of progress made by the Irish state towards achieving the ideals of 1916. However, snide commentary from conservative Irish language speakers continued to be carried in the Irish press, with the Irish language section of the Connaught Tribune, for example, making light of the young hunger strikers' efforts. It claimed it had never heard of Misneach until this action, and mockingly referred to Nelson's column destroyed by the IRA earlier in 1966. Quote, nach é an trua I nach raibh an sean fill an le go rachadí sús a war agus an jaran I enf nís gura do flahish. Isn't it a pity the old pillar isn't still there so they could make their complaints closer to heaven? A fortnight after the hunger strike ended, Misneach began a campaign around language rights and the provision of services in Ireland by semi-state and semi-state bodies. Daithí Breathnach, a journalist and member of Misneach, was imprisoned towards the end of April 1966 for his refusal to pay a £2 fine imposed on him for failure to produce an insurance certificate for his car. He had asked for a printed version in Irish, but Norwich Union had offered it only a typewritten version, meaning that they would only facilitate Irish on this one occasion. On the day of his imprisonment, members of Misneach, including Peadar O'Brien, Kerron Ó Luain, Daeilgeoirí Ó Luain, as well as Seamus O'Toole, entered the Damer Hall Theatre during an interval in one of the plays to make an announcement. O'Toole, speaking in Irish, stated that Breathnach had been jailed for, quote, refusing to yield to the compulsory English of the Norwich Union Insurance Company. A defence fund was being organised, he announced, and they also made an announcement about their intention to picket Mountjoy Jail, where Breathnach was being held, and the headquarters of Norwich Union on Dawson Street. Breathnach went on hunger strike again, his second within the space of a fortnight. Other Irish language groups such as Gaeilgeoirí, Conn na Gaeilge and Cumann na Sagart offered their support. Several days later, Breathnach was released as a, quote, clerical friend paid the fine in question. Misneach were livid as they had not been consulted and responded that Breathnach had not asked for the fine to be paid, mar bhí ceisne consciente agus principle ann, as he was being held on a point of principle and conscience. This turn of events suited the government, as otherwise Breathnach was to be released on bail and had intended to continue fighting the case in confidence of victory. Following his release, he asked, quote, why must Irish speakers be second-class citizens? If they can give printed certificates in English to English speakers, they should give printed Irish certificates to those who speak the language of the country. Following on from these events, Misneach called a Nora meeting in mid-May 1966, where they urged Irish speakers to ask for car insurance forms in Irish in order to, quote, help spread the use of the language in the business life of the country. By this stage, it had set up an advisory committee and a special aid fund to assist Irish speakers who encountered legal problems when attempting to assert their rights. O'Toole called on all Irish speakers to use the language in their dealings with the state and semi-state bodies, quote, as they were entitled to do so according to the Constitution. The following week, as part of the campaign to exert pressure on the state to provide services in the Irish language, a meeting was held in the Metropole Hotel in Cork. Kerron Ó Luain of Dublin remarked on how the Irish language community could not be Misneach as party politics have faith in any political party. They would have to stand independently and fight for their rights. Seamus O'Toole from Cork emphasised the need to correspond and receive documentation in Irish from the state and semi-state bodies, and he appointed some blame onto Irish speakers, some blame onto Irish speakers who did not create the demand for those services. Eoin Ó Muircheartaigh noted that the end of policy and flámáis, the policy of flattery, would have to come if the Irish language was to survive in the face of English. Other speakers included Nula Gaeilgeoirí, president of the Cócáid of Richard Ó Muircheartaigh of Conn na Gaeilge's executive committee, and Daithí Breathnach of Misneach, Dublin. Throughout the course of Misneach's early existence, it found itself locked in a battle with the language freedom movement. The LFM sought the removal of Irish as a requirement for entry into the civil service and the ending of the requirement to pass Irish in order to obtain a leaving certificate. Misneach, of course, sought to maintain these requirements, viewing their removal as an erosion of Irish within the state apparatus. The attitudes of the population at large to these conflicts are probably best summed up in the opinion of the Longford leader. On LFM calls to remove state support for Irish, the leader recognised the, quote, absurdity of one generation having the right to decide whether a language some thousands of years old should live or die. Yet it reverted to the whataboutery so prevalent then and since, when it declared that, quote, the language fracas diverts the attention of the people from their proper aim, the solution of the problems of ordinary living. So in the opinion of the leader's editor, Irish should be maintained as a symbolic and defining feature of nationhood, but economics should be prioritised. But this is exactly what Misneach had always proposed, the primacy of the material circumstances, hence the references to James Connolly and others, and O'Kine's assertion that the reconquest of Ireland, as he called it, needed to operate on both an anti-colonial and an anti-capitalist level and strive towards what he called the Gaelic Workers' Republic. The LFM, for their part, held several public meetings throughout the country from the mid-1960s, some of which were disrupted by members of Misneach. At one such meeting in the Mansion House in Dublin in September 1966, members of Misneach taunted the LFM by waving a British Union flag in front of them. A fight then broke out among about 10 men, and order was only restored when LFM leaders agreed to let several of their opponents speak at the meeting. Rowland argues that, ironically, although both groups bitterly opposed one another, they shared similarities. Both sought to influence the future direction of the state through a rights-based and nationalist discourse during a period when social and economic changes allowed for the question of its direction to be discussed. It is questionable, however, whether characterising the LFM as nationalist is appropriate. In fact, I would argue they stem from a deeply ingrained pro-colonial and anti-nationalist tradition, albeit one that was now cloaked in the rhetoric of a more modern liberalism. The disruption of public meetings was used as a tactic by Misneach against not only the LFM, but against the government. This Misneach did at the opening of the Peadar Ó Luain commemoration Gaeilgeoirí at the Derry Hotel in Dundalk in mid-April 1969, one of their last significant appearances in the English-speaking national press. The Irish press reported that, quote, as soon as the chairman of the meeting, Untitled Chapter of Faughart, rose to address the 400 people present, members of Misneach, an ultra-left Irish language group, began a verbal attack on the Minister for the Gaeltacht, Mr. Pádraig Faulkner. End quote. The meeting, which included several priests, nuns, and teenagers, as reported by the press, was interrupted for 20 minutes, and, quote, 4-letter words and other unprintable statements were directed at the minister. Martin O'Kane, Seamus O'Toole, and Kerron Ó Luain were central to the protest. They spoke in English to the minister and accused him of neglecting the Gaeltacht and the revival project, while they also distributed pamphlets among the attendees and promised to interrupt government ministers in the same way in future. Earlier in January 1969, during the 50th commemoration of the first Dáil Éireann of 1919, Misneach demanded of the government that the proceedings be in Irish as they were on the first occasion. They warned that it ought not to be in English, le cúpla nach cráfach de Gaeilge, with a few symbolic Irish phrases, or it would demonstrate that there was nothing really to commemorate. Misneach suffered a hammer blow in 1970 with the death of Martin O'Kane at the age of 64. In 1971, they staged one of their final acts of direct action when they interrupted the Minister for Education, Pádraig Faulkner, once again at Féile Irile in O'Mead in County Louth. That same year, by misfortune, Seamus O'Toole happened to be in Belfast during the period of mass internment of nationalists by the British Army. O'Toole was interned in Crumlin Road Jail, and Misneach held a protest at the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin demanding action. These few protests in 1971 seem to have been Misneach's last planned interjections into Irish political life in that era. With O'Kine's death and the beginning of an anti-colonial war in the north, to which some of Misneach's members turned their attention, the group went into decline. The LFM's goals were achieved when in 1973 it was no longer mandatory to pass Irish in order to get a leaving certificate. And by 1974, the language had been removed as a requirement for entry into the civil service. But despite these setbacks, the late 1960s had seen the seeds of two important and interrelated movements being planted. The first was Glúiseal Carta Síobháilte na Gaeilgeoirí, the Gaeilgeoirí civil rights movement, a movement that was strongly influenced by global democratic mobilizations for civil rights, as well as by the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. O'Kine had been involved with the Glúiseal Carta Síobháilte na Gaeilgeoirí, which demanded rights such as a Gaeltacht authority and a radio station for the Irish-speaking districts. Running in tandem with this was the emergence of the Gael School or Irish Medium School movement from about 1969 onwards. The struggle to keep one Gaeltacht school open in Dunqueen in County Kerry saw the intersection of the Gael School movement, which was quite urban in character, with that of the rural Gaeltacht civil rights campaign. Indeed, in the year of his death, 1970, O'Kine spoke in Scoil Dunqueen as part of the effort to keep it open. These developments in terms of Misneach take us through to the 21st century iteration of the group. Although the Gaeltacht Civil Rights Campaign achieved a number of victories for the Gaeltacht, the achievements could not withstand the years of neoliberal austerity of 2008 onwards. From 2010, and in response to the recommendations of the so-called board snip Nua that tens of millions should be cut from Gaeltacht and Irish language budgets, a number of young Irish language activists, many of whom had come through the Gael school system founded back in the 1970s, had begun discussing a radical response. Much like O'Kine and the Misneach of the 1960s, they saw that the official language movement was too wedded to the neoliberal doctrine of the 26 county state. There were also activists from Belfast who believed the language movement there needed to return to the radical decolonial roots of the 1950s through to the 1980s in the north. Consequently, and with the blessing of the remaining members of the 1960s, Misneach was formed, or rather reformed, with a new young cohort of activists and launched publicly in Dublin in 2013. In the following years, branches emerged outside of Dublin and Belfast in places like Galway, Cork, the Donegal, Gaeltacht and elsewhere. In terms of politics, the 21st century Misneach is perhaps more diverse. While fundamentally a socialist and republican radical Irish language group, it also encompasses anarchist, anti-racist and global decolonial political thought. Although engaging in protest when necessary, and perhaps in contrast to the Misneach of the 1960s, Misneach of today focus also on political education, on creating social spaces for Irish speakers which aren't commercialised, as well as building campaigns and alliances with other left-wing groups from the grassroots up. This is reflected in the more structured means of organisation with a formalised national committee, officers, local branches, and an annual general meeting called Mehel Misneach. To conclude, the overriding similarity between the Misneach of the 1960s and that of the 2010s onwards is that both emerged for two reasons. The first is that capitalism, whether of the 1960s early neoliberal variety or the more blatant neoliberalism of the 2010s, as well as a lingering and potent colonial culture, it was decimating Irish language communities through marginalisation, emigration, lack of investment, and indeed cuts to investment. The second was that at both junctures, the official and state-funded Irish language organisations failed to actively resist these moves by the state, while also failing to analyse and properly identify the key point, that the survival of the language was a social and is a social question and can only be ultimately resolved by massive redistribution of wealth and power, or as O'Kine professed, quote, a revolution of the mind and of the soul, a revolution in wealth, ownership and living standards. You know?
Well, got a mark, Kerron, an syml fad. Thanks very much for that. That was well, extremely interesting, and you know, from my point of view, not knowing a great deal about Misneach, but as you said, you know, we've just celebrated the 60th anniversary of Tynged yr Iaith. If celebrate is the right word to use, but at least we've you know, sort of taken notice of it. So it's very interesting to see, to think about the similarities, but also some of the differences maybe in the two movements that were in some way inspired by that. So I will question agib a charge. Oes na question now, gwbl? I'm sure there must be some questions. I mean, do sort of make yourself known if you'd like to ask a question, and then you can just sort of unmute yourself and do so. Yes, David.
Hi, thanks so much for that. That's given me a whole new piece of the jigsaw that I never knew I was lacking, and that's been really important for me. Thanks very much. I used to live until very recently just up the road from Rosmuck, and of course O'Kine was kind of still haunting that whole area with the power of his intellect and those. The question I've got is, although he was clearly a driving force in Misneach and a driving force initially, obviously he was near the end there at the time when the Gluaiseach cathartha Civilta came along. You presented that as a very continuous transition from Misneach's standpoint and aims and methods into their standpoints and aims and methods. Can we look at that in a bit more detail, in the sense that I've always kind of seen them as actually a fair break from maybe Misneach's overarching, very ambitious, fundamental political aims into a much more practical, Gaeltacht driven and highly successful movement in many respects, in the sense that they got the radio. They didn't get quite the television station they wanted. They got some of what they wanted from Udrus. I'm just really interested in that contrast, I guess, between Misneach and the Gluaiseach. Have you got any more thoughts on that?
Well, as I sort of pointed out in the paper, I think the Misneach were urban and they were professional, you know, middle class people mostly. And I know with Seamus O'Toole went on to be a barrister, and Ono Murrick, who went on to be a successful journalist, and that was that sort of 19th, early 20th century cultural revivalist tradition really passing through into the 60s. And there is a suspicion, I mean, you're right, there is I mean, in terms of what they wanted fundamentally, in terms of, you know, saving the Gaeltacht, the Gluaiseach and Misneach had the same goals, but the ideology was different. I think there wasn't. The Gaeltacht ideology is more about what can be achieved for the locality than what can be achieved for the nation as a whole. I think in terms of the reconquest that O'Kine talked about, O'Kine was really an outlier. I think. I mean, there were other socialists coming from the Gaeltacht through, you know, Liam O'Flaherty and Pádraig O'Connor and Liam O'Flaherty in the 1920s was involved with the Soviet in Dublin. I only learned this myself recently. He went into he was a Gaeltacht man. He led a Soviet that took over the Rotunda in Dublin during the Irish Revolution. And then Pádraig O'Connor, he was one of the sort of key writers and or poets of the sort of 30s and 40s. And he was very socialist as well. So there was a strand of socialism in the Gaeltacht. There's some tradition, but I mean, largely you're right. There is a divorce there between the sort of urban Gaelic revivalist and the Gaeltacht people, and that's unfortunate, but it's the truth, and it's very hard to marry those two. O'Coin tried to marry it, and he did probably most successfully, as you point out, with things where he became more practical in terms of winter the Gaeltacht in the 30s, and there was a clear goal, we need to found a colony or a settlement here in Rathcarn, or we need an Údarás, a Gaeltacht authority and a radio station, and that's to be campaigned for. But when Misneach in the 60s were highlighting or pointing out that the revival had stalled or failed, they were less successful because they weren't demanding tangible things. So maybe that was it. He tried to marry those two strands, and he did in the Gluaiseacht, more so probably than through Misneach, because although he was a Gaeltacht figure and there were other Gaeltacht people involved, and it was mostly Dublin, Cork and Belfast people. So there's that parallel but divergent two strands, certainly, yeah.
Thanks. That's grand. Thanks a lot.
Does anyone else have a question there?
I'll ask one, so if there's a space. So you mentioned that Misneach, the newer version, of which I'm a proud member, one of those anarchist members who you mentioned, has put emphasis on making allegiances or alliances with other left-wing groups. Did that happen at all with the 60s iteration?
Well, no, I don't think by choice or by any sort of strategy. I think it was like in terms of their formation, they were they set out not to be like the pre-existing organizations. It was O'Coin or some of the members complained that, or Micheál McAngus actually, it was one of the members complained that anything that had to be done in terms of the Irish language movement in the 60s, in terms of Gaelin or Cunnan or Gaeilge, required a committee meeting to do it. And they were sort of bored of this method that you had to go and pass everything through a sort of set of rules or the standing orders and so forth. So they wanted a more sort of looser and a more autonomous means of organising, and that suited them in terms of staging ad hoc or impromptu protests when a government minister would appear, or when a fine needed to be protest, or an imprisonment or a fine that wasn't paid need to be protested about. They could just go and do it. But so I don't think they would have consciously said, right, we need to work with these certain groups. But as I mentioned, the milieu of them that existed there, in terms of they were moving in the sort of Republican movement pre the 1969 split, there was a sort of organic crossover of membership, and some of them remained members of the Cunra and still are, even years later, but they were just diverging with them in terms of culture and strategy at the time. But they could have been various like multi-memberships of these different groups, but I wouldn't call them formal alliances of any sort, from what I can see anyway.
Mererid. Ti ar mute.
Sorry, diolch yn fawr iawn, and you may have touched on this because I missed a little bit towards the beginning, but to what extent is this group linked in, was it linked in with groups outside of Ireland? You mentioned, of course, Wales, but on an international or global scale, was there associations with other movements? That's my question.
Yeah, not that I can think of at the minute. Not really, no. I mean, O'Coin was aware of other movements, or he was aware of global politics, and David mentioned the Gaeilgeoirí Seminarau. They were more, I mean, they were directly influenced by, as I mentioned, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, and then who were in turn directly influenced by the civil rights associations of the African Americans in America, who, you know, they had the same sort of chants, the same mantras, and the same slogans, and even the same sort of political strategies about non-violent action and, you know, civil rights and so forth. So I would say Misneach members had that themselves because they were, again, operating in that milieu, but again, they didn't release a lot of structured policy documents or structured even statements, and that's you know, it was more sort of impromptu commentary when they were staging protests, rather than this is how we relate to you know, global decolonial movements, or, you know, this is our policy on language rights throughout the Celtic countries. Are very, you know, it didn't seem there was that, and probably because they were so involved in other groups. I mean, a lot of them were key players in, you know, the Republican movement and so forth at the time. So they probably thought or viewed, you know, that as the main sort of driving force, because for people, radicals in 1960s Ireland, the Republican movement was the main driving force, and Misneach people wanted to sort of bring an Irish language dynamic into that, you know, rather than maybe build an Irish language movement from the ground up, but bring and critique also the official language movement. So it was trying to do those two things rather than, I don't think they envisaged building themselves into a coherent political force themselves. They had these opinions on various different countries, but I mean, I think they did as individuals and as members of other movements, I suppose. It comes down to the sort of ad hoc nature of their organisation, which, you know, it didn't require, I suppose, policy documents.
Diolch yn fawr.
There's a question in the chat here from Moira. To what degree do you feel that the start of the Troubles in the North had an influence on Misneach as a movement? I've heard that the situation in the North had a chilling effect on language activists, who are often seen as being connected to violence, even if they weren't.
Yeah, well, I mean, O'Toole, the secretary, was interned perhaps by mistake, or he was in Belfast, but probably, maybe, I'm not sure why he was there. Maybe he was there engaging in Republican activism. And as I mentioned, Ono Murricu, one of the other key members, became more involved with the official Republican movement for a while. And I suppose, yeah, I mean, a lot of, to come back to the point about the, you know, they were maybe a component part of the Republican movement. A lot of all the energies then went to the North for those who believed in that, and then Others, I mean, would have stepped back as well, I suppose, depending on their views of the use of violence and so forth. But I mean, then the tradition in the north was, I mean, another tradition in terms of Misneach in Belfast. I mean, they, and I've looked at them, I've talked to them, and interviewed them in terms of the members of Misneach in Belfast would have gone on and founded the first Bun School, the first school in Belfast in 1971, the first Gael school. And the sort of ideas with them is that they were building their own thing while the war was going on around them. So, you know, that was their decolonial activism. They weren't, I mean, there was assistance there from like the Sinn Féin and, you know, the Republican movement in the north, but the members of Misneach who went on and became involved in Gael school activism and building up the urban Gaeltacht in Belfast and places like that, they were again sort of running parallel to it but not involved in it. So it wouldn't have had a chilling effect in the north. They would have it would have probably spurred them on, if anything. That's why one of the reasons the language revival is more radical in the 6 counties is because of this sort of colonial dynamic, the more forceful colonial dynamic. But in the 70s as well, in the 26 counties, I think a lot of, because the Gael school movement was sort of burgeoning at that time, a lot of the energies of Irish language activists would have been put into that. And that's when really in the 70s and 80s, the school movement starts to snowball. And, you know, people sort of realised that the state wasn't going to do it for them. So they had to sort of build the schools in their locality themselves, if that makes sense.
Thanks very much again, Kerron. We should probably let you go now. You've been speaking for an hour now, but it's been wonderful to hear about this and so on. Just before everybody goes, just a couple of things to say. Unrhyw, Matasha Begiri Gaeilgeoirí be pop-up Gaeltacht awn so goops I her Jerdyn is doilum ag la o'r hys shacht. So, you know, please do go to that pop-up Gaeltacht in the Coops on Thursday at 7:30. This has been our first seminar this semester in this series, and there are others on the way. You will be inundated with information about them soon enough, I'm sure. But I will just mention that the next one will be on the 15th of March. Our own Robin Chapman will be talking in Welsh, but there will be a transition. And his title is Pwy Bia Arti Jenkins, Nodiadau Arlunio Cofiant. So he's talking about putting together a biography of Arti Jenkins. And that will be on the 15th of March at 7 o'clock rather than 7:30. But don't worry, you will be you'll be deluged with information about that in due course. Thanks very much once again, Kerron, and thank you all for coming along to listen.
Thanks for having me. Diolch.